I was 31 years old, standing in my childhood kitchen on a Tuesday morning, watching my mother stir her coffee the way she always had. Slow, counterclockwise 3 times, then tap the spoon twice on the rim. Some habits are so deeply wired into a person that they become their signature. That sound, that tiny clink of metal on ceramic, meant safety to me for as long as I could remember. I had no idea that 4 months later, I would be sitting in a hospital waiting room in a city I had never been to, praying she was still alive. My mother built Hartwell & Co. from nothing. That is not me being dramatic. That is a fact I watched happen in real time, from the time I was old enough to fold napkins at the reception desk. She started it as a small event planning business out of our house in Columbus, Ohio, doing birthday parties and small corporate lunches. By the time I was in high school, she had a real office downtown, a staff of 12, and contracts with 3 of the largest hotel chains in the state. By the time I graduated college, Hartwell & Co. was doing over $2 million a year in revenue. She built that. She alone. My father left when I was 4, and she never once asked anyone for help. My older brother, the one everyone in the family adored and I had learned to quietly distrust, came back into the picture when I was 26. His name is not worth dwelling on too long. Let me just call him what he was, the favorite, the charming one. The one who could walk into a room and make my mother's entire face change. He had moved to Phoenix after college to pursue opportunities, which really meant he floated around for 7 years doing very little while my mother wired him money she never mentioned to me. I only found that out later. Much later. He moved back to Columbus when he was 34. And within 3 months, he had convinced my mother to give him a title at Hartwell & Co., Director of Business Development. A title he invented with a salary I was not supposed to ask about. I asked about it once. My mother looked at me across the dinner table and said, "He's family, sweetheart. And he's finally ready to do something with his life. Let's support that." I smiled and said, "Of course." And I went home and cried in my car for 20 minutes because I had been working at that company for 4 years, had my actual event management certification, had brought in 6 new corporate clients the previous year, and had never once been offered a director title. That was old pain. I had learned to live with it the way you learn to live with a bad knee. It flares up sometimes, you manage it, you keep going. What I could not manage, what I had no framework for, was what happened the following spring. My mother called me on a Friday evening, excited in a way I had not heard in a long time. She said my brother had planned a surprise for her, a weekend trip to Asheville, North Carolina. Just the 2 of them, to celebrate the company's 20th anniversary. He had booked a bed and breakfast, made dinner reservations, the whole thing. She sounded like a teenager going to prom. She said, "He's really trying, isn't he? I think he's really trying, isn't he? I think he's really changing." I said, "That's wonderful, Mom. You deserve a trip." And I meant it. I genuinely did. Whatever my complicated feelings about my brother were, I wanted my mother to be happy. She worked harder than anyone I had ever known. A weekend away sounded good for her. She texted me Saturday morning from the road. A photo of a gas station coffee cup with a little heart emoji. Classic Herb, with a little heart emoji. She never texted again after that. By Sunday night, when she had not responded to my check-in message, I told myself she was probably just enjoying herself, phone in her bag, living in the moment the way I was always telling her to do. By Monday morning, when she didn't show up to the office and didn't answer her phone, I started making calls. My brother answered on the second ring. "She's fine," he said, before I even finished asking. "She wanted to extend the trip. She's just taking some personal time." Something in my stomach turned to ice. "She didn't tell me that," I said. "She didn't want to worry you. You know how you get. You know how you get. You know how you get." That phrase, that specific diminishment, had been used on me my entire life to make my valid concerns sound like character flaws. I took a breath. "Can you put her on? She's sleeping. It's 11 in the morning. She's tired, Addie. Can you let her rest?" Addie. My name is Adelaide. He only ever shortened it when he wanted to make me feel small. I hung up and drove to my mother's house. Her car was in the driveway. Her reading glasses were on the kitchen counter next to an unfinished crossword puzzle. Her overnight bag was gone. A single coffee mug sat in the dish rack, rinsed and dried. Everything looked the way it looked when she left for a normal day, except she had not come back from a normal day. I called the bed and breakfast in Asheville. The woman who answered was polite, confused, and then apologetic. They had a reservation under my brother's name. He had checked in Saturday. He had checked out Sunday morning, alone. I sat down on my mother's kitchen floor and did not get up for a long time. Here is what I pieced together over the following 72 hours. Through phone calls and panic and conversations, I had to keep very calm, for even though I was screaming inside. My brother had taken my mother to Asheville, as planned. They had dinner Saturday evening at the restaurant he had booked. My mother, according to a waitress who spoke to investigators later, had seemed completely fine at the beginning of the meal. Talkative, laughing, ordering the salmon. Somewhere around the second glass of wine, she became quiet. Foggy. The waitress assumed she was tired from the drive. My brother paid the check, helped my mother out of the restaurant with his arm around her, and that was the last confirmed sighting. He told police that they had an argument Sunday morning and she left on her own. He said she was upset about something personal and needed space. He filed a voluntary departure report, which is not the same as a missing persons report and which took 4 additional days to escalate to anything that resembled a real investigation. During those 4 days, he drove back to Columbus, returned to the office on Monday, and told our staff that our mother was taking some personal time. During those same 4 days, he had a meeting with the company's business attorney. I found that out from our office manager, a woman named Terry who had worked for my mother for 11 years and who came to me privately, visibly shaken, to tell me what she had seen on the conference room calendar. He said it was about updating the company's succession documents, Terry said. He asked me not to mention it. I stared at her. Succession documents. That's what he said. My mother had been missing for 4 days and my brother was meeting with an attorney about who would inherit the company. I want to be honest about something. For a long time, even in those early days, a small voice in the back of my mind kept trying to give him the benefit of the doubt. That voice sounded like my mother. It sounded like every holiday dinner where she talked about how proud she was of him, how she believed in second chances, how family was everything. That voice had been trained into me over 30 years and it was very hard to silence. I silenced it anyway, because my mother was missing and he was rewriting who owned her company. I hired a private investigator on day 5. I maxed out one of my credit cards to do it. I did not care. The investigator, a former county sheriff named Gus, who looked like he had seen everything and was tired of all of it, told me on our first call to write down everything I knew and start from the beginning. I talked for 40 minutes. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "The restaurant. I'll start there." While Gus worked, I kept going into the office. I want to be clear about why. Not because I was calm, not because I was functional, but because my mother had built that company and I was not going to let it fall apart while she was gone. I showed up every morning. I answered emails. I managed the team. I smiled at the clients who did not know anything was wrong, and I went home every night and stared at the ceiling until 3 a.m. My brother acted, during this period, like a man who was waiting for something. That was the only way I could describe it. He came into the office, he was pleasant. He did not cry, he did not rage, he did not seem afraid. He seemed like someone sitting in an airport, watching the arrivals board, knowing his flight was going to land eventually. Gus called me on day 9. He had found my mother. She was in a residential care facility outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, about 4 hours from Asheville. She had been admitted 6 days earlier as a Jane Doe, after a truck driver found her walking along a rural highway at dawn, disoriented, unable to say her name or where she lived. The facility had assumed she was experiencing a psychiatric episode. They had been waiting for someone to come forward to identify her. I drove to Knoxville in 3.5 hours. I may have been speeding the entire way. I did not particularly care. When I walked into her room, she was sitting up in bed looking out the window. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her. She turned when she heard the door open and she looked at my face and something in her expression cracked open. Not recognition exactly, not yet, but something like the memory of safety. Like a reflex. Hi, she said. Cautious. Uncertain. Hi, Mum. I sat down next to her bed and took her hand, and I did not cry because I could not afford to fall apart yet. I've been looking for you. She blinked. I don't remember how I got here. I know. I'm going to help you figure that out. The toxicology work took another few days. The attending physician at the facility told me that whatever had been in her system had largely metabolized by the time she was admitted, but there were trace markers consistent with a class of drug. He used a term I did not know, a sedative amnesiac compound, something used sometimes in surgical settings that in the wrong dose administered to someone without medical supervision could cause extended disorientation and significant short-term memory disruption. In plain language, something had been put in her system that was designed to make her not remember. I drove back to Columbus the day after that conversation. I went directly to the police department. I sat down with a detective and I put a folder on her desk that contained Gus's report, the toxicology summary, a printed copy of my brother's attorney meeting calendar from Terry, screenshots of text messages in which my brother had described my mother as taking personal time to multiple people including clients, and a timeline I had written myself that started with the dinner reservation in Asheville and ended with my mother being found walking a highway alone with no shoes. The detective looked through the folder without speaking. Then she looked at me. How long have you had all of this? She asked. I've been building it for 8 days, I said. She closed the folder. Okay, she said. Let's start from the beginning. My brother was arrested 12 days later at a restaurant, which I found poetically appropriate, having lunch with the attorney he had been quietly working with to restructure my mother's business interests. The charge at that point was elder abuse and administration of a controlled substance without consent. Additional charges followed. The thing people ask me most often when I tell this story is whether I was surprised, whether I saw it coming. And I have to be honest, the specific method shocked me. I had not imagined that. But the shape of it, the entitlement, the patience, the willingness to treat my mother as an obstacle to be managed rather than a person to be loved, I had been watching that build my entire life. I had named it quietly to myself 100 times and then talked myself out of it because naming it out loud meant dismantling the story my family had always told about him. It is very hard to be the one who says the thing out loud first. It is very easy to be called paranoid, jealous, difficult. You know how you get. I had been called all of those things. I had believed them, at least partially, because when you hear something about yourself often enough from people you love, it sticks. It took my mother being found walking barefoot on a Tennessee highway for me to finally stop believing it. My mother's memory came back in stages over about 6 weeks. Not all at once. First her name, then the general shape of her life, then specific people, then events, then nuance. The weekend itself she may never fully recover. The doctors are careful not to make promises about that. But she knows what happened. She knows who did it. She has said, in the particular way she says hard things, which is quietly and only once, that she is grateful she raised a daughter who paid attention. I am not going to pretend recovery was smooth after that. My mother struggled. There were days she would start to say something and her sentences would drift, and I could see her frustration. This woman who had run a multi-million-dollar business on the strength of her communication, struggling to find words. There were nights she called me just to hear my voice, not to say anything specific. I always answered. I will always answer. Hartwell & Co. is still running. I am running it now, officially. My mother made that change as soon as she was legally able to. We have talked about rebranding. We have talked about a lot of things. Mostly we just work, side by side, the way we always did before I was old enough to be jealous of how much easier everything seemed for someone else. The hardest lesson I took from all of this was not about my brother. That part, painful as it was, turned out to be the simpler part. The harder lesson was about myself, about how many years I spent doubting my own perception because it was more comfortable to be wrong than to be the person who caused conflict. I was not wrong. I had not been wrong for a long time. I had just been waiting for proof that I would never have needed if I had trusted myself sooner. My mother is sitting in the next room right now. I can hear her on a client call, her voice steady and warm the way it has always been, Occasionally she pauses, searching for a word, and then she finds it. She always finds it. 3 times a week in the morning, I hear her stir her coffee. Slow, counterclockwise, tap tap, and I walk into the kitchen and I pour myself a cup, and we sit together for a few minutes before the day starts, and neither of us says anything about what happened because we do not need to anymore. We both know. We both made it. That is enough. There is a version of this story where I never make the calls, where I tell myself I'm overreacting, that I'm being the difficult one again, that my brother probably has an explanation and I should wait and see. I lived inside that version for most of my life. It almost cost my mother everything. What I keep coming back to is this. The moments that defined how this ended were not dramatic. They were small. They were me choosing again and again to trust what I actually saw over what I had been told to see. That is not a natural instinct when you have spent 30 years being handed a different version of reality by the people you love most. It is something you have to practice, almost like a muscle, until it stops feeling like betrayal and starts feeling like self-respect. My brother made choices, and those choices had consequences. Not because the universe was keeping score in any mystical sense, but because the practical reality of exploiting people is that it requires them to stay confused. The moment I stopped being confused, the whole structure he had built started coming apart. He needed my silence. He needed my doubt. He needed me to keep being the daughter who wondered if maybe she was just too sensitive, too jealous, too whatever. The second I stopped giving him that, he had nothing left to work with. I think about my mother in that facility in Knoxville, sitting up in bed, not knowing her own name. I think about how she'd spent her entire adult life building something real, not just a business, but a standard of integrity, of showing up, of doing the work without cutting corners or stepping on anyone to get there. She modeled that for me every single day, even when I was too busy resenting the uneven attention to notice what she was actually teaching. She was teaching me what it looks like to build something that lasts. The tragedy is that the person she could not see clearly was the one sitting right across from her at dinner. That is not a weakness I judge her for. It is a very human thing to be blind to danger wearing a familiar face. What matters is what you do when the blindfold finally comes off. What I did was act. Not perfectly, not without fear, but I acted. I hired Gus when I had no guarantee it would lead anywhere. I walked into that police station with a folder I had built on faith and stubbornness. I kept showing up to the office every morning, not because I was calm, but because giving up was not something my mother had ever modeled for me, and I was not about to start. Terry told me later that she had almost not come to me with what she saw on that calendar. She said she was afraid of being wrong, afraid of the consequences, afraid of getting in the middle of a family situation. I understand that. I was afraid too. The difference between fear that stops you and fear that moves you is not about how brave you are. It is about what you decide matters more, your comfort or the truth. My mother is okay. The company is okay. I am okay, in the particular way you are okay after something like this. Meaning I am functional and forward-moving, and also occasionally standing in the kitchen at 7 a.m., just listening to the sound of a spoon tapping twice on the rim of a coffee mug, feeling grateful in a way that does not have words. Adelaide is my name. I trust it now.